Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody. My name is Russell Wald, and I'm the Executive Director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, HAI. And thank you for being here today. On behalf of HAI and our partners at the Stanford Data Science and the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's fireside chat, Entering a New Era of Human Civilization. We're living through a moment when advances in AI are not only accelerating technological change, but also reshaping geopolitics, economic systems, and the ways societies organize themselves. At HAI and through our partnership with Stanford Data Science, our mission is to ensure that these technologies are developed and deployed in ways that benefit people and society. Our interdisciplinary work across Stanford focuses on AI inspired by human intelligence, the societal impacts of AI, and applications that augment human capabilities. Today's conversation sits right at that intersection where technical progress meets societal impact and where questions of trust and governance become central as AI reshapes daily life and geopolitics. Now, it is my pleasure to turn this over to Dr. Colin Call, who's the director, and Stephen C. Hawsey, Senior Fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, to introduce our speakers. Thank you, Colin.
Thanks, Russell. Hey, hi, everybody. I'm Colin Call. For the past 20 days, I've been the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. So if you're wondering why I'm not Michael McFaul, it's because I'm not Michael McFaul. We at FSI is a center of centers. We have 9 interdisciplinary research centers that focus on different aspects of international affairs. Like many places on campus, much of our, increasing amount of our research is focusing on the implications of artificial intelligence for specific countries, specific regions, for geopolitics, for democracy, for the environment. And so it's a real pleasure of mine to co-sponsor this terrific conversation alongside HAI. So I'm not going to belabor anything more about FSI, but if you're interested in what we're doing in this area, check out our website. So we're especially fortunate to have 2 extraordinary thinkers with us. Thomas Friedman, as you all know, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and longtime observer of globalization, technology, and international affairs, whose work has helped millions understand how large-scale forces shape everyday life. Meanwhile, Craig Mundie brings decades of experience at the highest levels of technology leadership and policy, including shaping research, strategy, and global engagement around emerging technologies, not the least of which at Microsoft. Guiding today's discussions is our good friend John Hennessy, Stanford's former president, who joins us today as the moderator. We're deeply grateful to John for leading what promises to be a thoughtful and wide-ranging conversation on the implications of AI for human civilization. So it's no small topic. Together, our speakers will explore what it means to enter a new era of human civilization, looking not only at technological capability, but at institutions, norms, and responsibilities that must evolve alongside it. Following the conversation, there will be time for audience questions, so put your thinking caps on while you're listening. And with that, please join me in welcoming our moderator, John Hennessy, and our speakers, Craig Mundie and Thomas Friedman.
So I understand that the 2 of you have been interacting now for a number of years. Tell us a little bit how that started and maybe how it's affected your individual thinking independently of that engagement.
Oh, well, thank you, John. It's great to be here at Stanford and with you and with Craig. So 2004, I went on leave to write a book called The World is Flat. Came to see John Hennessy as one of the first people I interviewed, actually. And while I was on leave, I was invited to the Allen Conference in Sun Valley. And they'd invited me a bunch of years, a tech business conference, and I'd kind of turned it down because it felt like a busman's holiday, whatnot. And they asked me to give a talk about the book I was working on. And so I got up, and in the front row was Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and Michael Dell, and all these people. I was completely intimidated. The book was on the back of an envelope. I gave a talk about the book, and when it was done, Bill Gates walked up to me, and he had notes he'd written on both his hands. And he said to me, that was amazing. I said, you're talking to me? Okay. I told you something you don't know? He said, no, I knew it all. But I never put it together that way. And he said, you're 90% the way there. and I'm going to help you with the last 10%. But you have to meet me tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. in the Sun Valley Inn bar, and because I'm leaving right after. So 7 a.m., I and my wife, we get up, we go over there, we meet Bill. He spends 10 minutes on the part of the world that's not flat, part of America that's not flat, and the rest of the time on why open source software didn't belong in my book. Because open source was just emerging then, Linux, and I called it one of my flatteners, and he did not think that should be in the book. And so we went back and forth on that a lot, but he was leaving. So he said, I'm going to sign to you as your tutor, my chief technology officer, head of strategy and research for Microsoft, a guy named Craig Mundie. And Craig and I began a conversation then, and I've been blessed to have him as my technology tutor ever since for every book I've written. And we mesh together well because Craig is a brilliant supercomputer designer, and I'm a translator from English to English. And so it's been a great pleasure and partnership.
And who won the debate over open software?
Well, actually, it's very interesting. You know, I went to Redmond twice, actually.
Ah.
And we had some knockdown, drag 'em out fights. And in the end, I basically said, you know, guys, Tommy don't know bits and Tommy don't know bytes. Tommy do know news. And when the news is speaking to you, you better listen, otherwise it'll bite you in the ass. So open source is going to be in this book, but help me get it in the right perspective. And they really did. And so I didn't go crazy one way or another, and we came to a very happy medium. And when Microsoft ultimately bought GitHub, I felt vindicated.
So, Craig, how did this conversation affect your thinking about, particularly as technology has become so global, and that's Tom's real background and what the world is flat was about?
You know, my role at Microsoft was to start thinking about putting computers in everything beyond the PC. And I went there in 1992 to start doing that. And that led me into a world where almost everything we were looking at was in a regulated industry. And so I had decided, well, I better go talk to governments about this stuff, tell them we're coming, you know. And so that got me into, you know, what the rest of my career ended up being, which was sort of part tech diplomat, you know, and part geek. And so the conversations with Tom were easy in two dimensions. One is he said, I could help him understand the technology at a level that, you know, he was never trained to do. And that gave him confidence in what he was writing. And I hate to write, and he loves to write. I could just talk to him, and then stuff would materialize in columns and books. That was pretty good. And he continued doing that. We probably saw some of the big columns this year.
Yeah.
And so it's been a great partnership in that regard.
So, Tom, I think one of the things you've really done well is captured a moment in time. The world is flat, absolutely. Globalization, right? Hot, flat, and crowded, right? The environmental and global warming. How do you see this moment as having some of the same characteristics in terms of this multi-phase complexity that we're facing?
Well, we can talk about it from a whole bunch of different dimensions. I'm actually working on a book now on how to write a column, since everyone wants to be a columnist. So I thought I'd write a book about how you do it. And so the first half is really what makes a column work, how I learned, what I learned, etc. But the second half of the book is what I saw, because in 2028 I'll have been doing this for 50 years. You know, any journalist who's worked for 50 years thinks they were here for the big one. World War I, World War II, the rise of the internet, the opening to China, you name it. We were here for the big one. And the bridge chapter, because the first part of the book is how I write, second half is what I saw. And the bridge chapter is called The Second Big Bang. Because, you know, I always remind people, John, that when Gutenberg invented the printing press, someone was alive. And some monk said to some priest, now that is really cool. Okay, you mean I don't have to write this Bible out longhand anymore? We're going to stamp it out on what you call a printing press? I think we're here for a similar moment, which I call the second Big Bang. The first Big Bang was set up by God 13.8 billion years ago. And the second Big Bang was set off by us, that we have become godlike in 7 ways. So God created the earth in 7 days, and we have become godlike in 7 ways. Number one, we've created an artificial brain greater than we evolved with. We have decoupled intelligence from biology. If that isn't godlike, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, we've created a planetary nervous system where we can now hear each other whisper from one end of the world to the other. Third, we're the first species to ever change the climate, to drive ourselves from one climate epoch, the Holocene, into the Anthropocene. Fourth, we've created a new galaxy, cyberspace. We've created a whole new realm of human interaction where we're all connected and no one's in charge. Fifth, we've created deep learning, but at a depth we've never seen before. So back in 2012, IBM wired Lake George in upstate New York. They put sensors everywhere in the muck, on the shore, in the depths, on the waves, et cetera. And they fed it all into big data. And at the time, who led that project, head of IBM Research, John Kelly, gave me my all-time favorite quote, I think. He said, "Tom, the world has been speaking to us all these years. We just couldn't hear it. And now we're going to be able to hear it, not just put it into big data, but into AI. So we are going to have deep learning at a depth humans have never experienced before. Sixth, we split the atom, so we're the first of our generation of species can destroy the whole world. And last, and something Craig has turned me on to, and Mustafa Suleiman from Microsoft has also written about this, we're heading for a moment where human biology is too complicated for even a supercomputer, but not for a quantum computer. And this looming moment of quantum computing, fusion energy, and AI, infinite computing and infinite energy with AI gives you really the world that Craig and Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt wrote about in their book. It'll be a Genesis moment where we actually be able to create things from the atomic level up. If that isn't godlike, I don't know what is. So we've actually developed the power to part the Red Sea, but without the 10 commandments. And now we actually need what I call the 20 commandments. 10 for humans and 10 for the new, 10 for the people, the carbon species, and 10 for the silicon species. And that's sort of the foundation of what Craig and I have been talking about of late.
So, Craig, you've been in the tech business for a long time. You've seen all these technologies come, the rise of the internet, the rise of the personal computer, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, do you really see this as a turning point that's remarkably different than the earlier ones? Or can we just extrapolate from our experience in the past?
I think this is a discontinuity. And extrapolation really doesn't work. One way I describe this to people is pretty much everything humans have ever invented up to the present were just tools. We used them as a tool. It aided our physical capabilities, it aided our intellectual capabilities, but it was always just a tool. This is the first thing that doesn't stop at tool. It basically moves to where it has its own agency. It has its own capability. In the book, I said, this thing is a new species. It just isn't biological. And we're ultimately going to have to realize that first we have to coexist with it, not just use it as a tool. And then ultimately, based on what goes on there, we're going to have some long-term coevolutionary relationship with this new species. And nothing has ever gotten us to these two questions before.
And do you see, there's all this debate about exactly what AGI means and how to define it. But do you think we're at the beginning of that, or we're actually far down the road and the real breakthrough is going to occur in the near future beyond LLMs somehow?
Well, I think this will be a continuous, process. As I say, it's a long-term evolutionary relationship. But I think we're far enough into it now that it is meeting and exceeding human capabilities in at least certain specific domains. So I don't think it's actually important now to argue, how much farther, or how much longer it takes. For example, one thing that's been near and dear to my heart for 20 odd years is the whole cybersecurity problem. And the AIs, as they are today, represent a qualitative change in the cybersecurity risk, because by themselves, they can now essentially do as well or better than almost every, human in trying to penetrate our systems. And so because we've now made this available to everybody, instead of having only a handful of people who could whack away on our infrastructures, now, it only takes a couple of guys to be able to go attack these things. And so, I'm a lot more worried. People say, are you worried about the existential risks? And I say, yeah, well, I'm a lot more worried about the near-term risks.
Yeah.
And because they could be existential too. Just don't think about them that way.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about that risk, because it seems to me that trust is a point. You both raised this issue of trust and the importance of trust in the systems. How do you see that playing out, given both bad actors in the space as well as difficulties in controlling the technology and developing it, which are going to be uncertain for a while, probably?
But 10 years ago, I met Sam Altman for the first time, and they were still sort of hunting for their path. But they talked a lot about, in their founding, the idea of safety and alignment. And every time I would visit, we would talk some more about that. And by this time, I was past my Microsoft period, where I had dealt with the issues of technology changing society. And I kept saying, hey, this one is way bigger than that one. So, we really have to think about this stuff. So Sam said, okay, well, there's a couple of people here to think about that. Dario Amodei, he's here, he thinks about this. So he got the short straw. And every time I showed up, he had to talk to me about this. and actually, in a remark,
so then he left and started another company.
Yeah, but importantly, he left with an idea that I'll take some
he did.
Collaborative credit for. It didn't take us very long before we concluded asymptotically that the only way to control an AI was with an AI. And then he left and he went on his path. And a notable feature of Anthropic's product was he put a constitution in it as a way to try to create a governance mechanism within the AI to control itself. It turned out, while he was doing that, I was away pondering this question, and I decided that ultimately that was not going to be sufficient, and that you needed to have what I now call a trust architecture that dealt holistically with this problem. But it had to be rooted in a technical strategy. And so, in a sense, I've been now the last few years trying to convince people that there is a way to build an adjudication system that can operate on a universal basis on any AI, and to factor that problem out of the responsibility of any one person who wants to build any AI and deploy it in the world. And that this is a key part of how the new world order is going to have to emerge when AI has insinuated itself into just about everything. If you can't trust it, then you got the TikTok and Huawei problem on steroids. If you don't trust it, you want to ban it. But if you ban everything, then there's no trade. And, the world essentially kind of implodes in terms of economic terms. So I think there's a real imperative now to make some progress here. Before Henry Kissinger died, one of the last things he agreed with President Xi was that we would maintain a dialogue on this question, which I've chaired now for the U.S. side for 2 years. And it's been interesting because neither country, by my assessment, currently has a strategy to solve this governance problem, even for their own country, let alone between countries. And yet, if you want the world to operate in some new order where AI is a central element of it, you're going to have a trust architecture that spans more than one country.
So, Tom, from your perspective, longtime international correspondent and columnist, how do you see China accepting a kind of trust architecture that would be global, that we might agree with in some way? Seems like this is a very difficult problem, much harder than, say, controlling nuclear weapons, where you can control the material and a few special machines. This is software. It's hard to control.
So let me start at 30,000 feet and then go specifically to the China thing. Given these godlike powers we have amassed for ourselves, I'm a big believer in my friend Dov Seidman's dictum that interdependence is no longer our choice, it's our condition. We are going to rise together or we're going to fall together. But baby, whatever we're doing it together. And you can learn that early or you can learn that late, but we will learn that. So that's where I start. And because of that, I believe we are going to have to detribalize ourselves as a species faster than any time in human history, because we have three problems that are planetary in scale and have only planetary solutions: AI, climate, and nuclear weapons. And each is getting smaller and more distributed, at the same time. And we don't know where actually the tipping point is on all three. So when people who hear Craig and I talk say, yeah, but you and us in China, that's so naive. Yeah. I always say, yeah, naive. I'll tell you what's naive. Naive thinking we're going to be okay if we don't do it. So that's sort of my starting principle. So Craig and I collaborated on a long piece I did on AI that actually began where I really tried to elevate his ideas about how we get this adjudicator. I was in China last year for the China Development Forum, and they asked me to stay an extra day to speak to a group of Chinese economists they had assembled. And I said, look, my name is Thomas Friedman, not Milton Friedman. I'm not an economist. So I actually called Craig from Beijing, and we just started riffing on kind of what to say, whatever, and how to introduce this adjudicator idea. So I eventually got up in front of the group and I said, I have to tell you, I had a terrible nightmare last night. I dreamt that it was the year 2030 and all that America could sell China was soybeans. And all that China could sell America was soy sauce. Okay. Why? Because when AI is in everything, if we don't have a trust architecture, we're not going to sell you anything, and we're not going to buy you anything from you anything. Your doctor comes and says, John, I've got a hip replacement for you, best on the market by way. It's made in Shanghai. It'll be connected all the time, broadcasting. Not sure where the data goes or is stored. Are you going to buy that hip replacement? I might not. When, as Craig said, when AI is in everything becomes TikTok. And this debate we're having over TikTok is going to actually proliferate. And as Craig also says, that leaves you either with radical collaboration or autarky. But there'll be nothing in between.
So, Craig or Tom, how do you, even getting this to work among American companies seems very difficult. There's always somebody who'll race to the bottom and try to get some advantage by not complying with whatever this trust architecture implies, because it's got to imply some overhead, some additional work, right?
No.
How does that happen? No, it doesn't.
No, I mean, after a bunch of years of pondering this thing from a technical point of view, I decided that what you have to do if you want trust is you essentially have to factor out into a transparent, project, the construction of this adjudication AI. And only if you have a single, but, essentially hyperscalable instance of this thing, can you examine it and decide among any people whether you want to trust this thing or not. In the end, I think it's inevitable that you're going to do that. But comes back to the thing that the companies could say, well, if each built their own, even if you gave them a common rule set, you still have no idea whether they actually all did it in a uniform way. And if you say, oh, now I've got DeepSeek Quen over there, what rules are they training on? What will do? So my view is you have to create an environment where you can have my rules in my house. So if I make an AI here and want to send it to China, when it lands in China, it has to be controlled under the rules in China. And if DeepSeek shows up here, it has to basically be controlled under the US rules. Without DeepSeek or OpenAI or Anthropic, anyway, they don't have to do anything. This thing has to essentially encapsulate them and find a way to look at context in which it's operating and then make a decision in real time. Again, from a compendium of all the rules, which don't have to be pre-negotiated. Everybody can have their own rules. There's two things you can't violate, in my opinion, if you want to bootstrap this on a multinational basis. You can't require the elimination of strategic competition.
Right.
Because that's a non-starter. And in fact, it's the fear of that has forced people to walk backwards from regulation.
Mm-hmm.
The regulation screws up my competition.
Right. If it's not even, if it doesn't create a level playing field, you'll never get it. Never get it accepted.
Well, but if there's an overhead where every company gets slowed down trying to regulate mine and the other guy doesn't regulate it, I end up losing.
Then you screw.
That's screwed. Okay, so you can't do that. The other thing you can't do is you can't tell anybody that the rule set that's going to judge their AI's behavior gets crammed down on them from anybody else. So this is the problem that that Anthropic had to some extent when he put the AI, when he put the Constitution in his product. The first question people asked is, well, where did it come from? They said, well, we wrote it, and here it is. And a lot of people said, that's great, but it's not my Constitution. All right. And so, and other people say, oh, well, if you're going to get this together, don't you have to come up with some consensus on the rules? Like I gave a talk about this in Washington in a policy forum, and one young staffer stood up and asked me, but how are you going to guarantee that the U.S.'s laws and our democratic principles are crammed down on the Chinese and the Indians and everybody else at the same time? I said, not my job. All right. My job is to create a neutral system. The analogy for me is operating systems. All right. When we built operating systems at Microsoft, we had to ship in 192 countries, and it had to be completely neutral. And we did that at a very high scale. And it took a lot of engineering, but ultimately we did it because we didn't want to build 192 instances of Windows. We wanted one that could essentially, chameleon-like, behave the right way in every country. So sort of having been schooled on that process, I'm saying, okay, I can see a path to doing that again, where I build a neutral adjudication system as a completely open thing. So the companies participate in it. The government mandates its adoption for those who want to cooperate. And the academy becomes the place where societies turn collectively for validation of this thing. And so now what you've got is very clear roles for the government. They only have one job, maybe two. One is to compel the people in their society that their products, their AIs, have to basically be adjudicated. Then we wanted to distinguish, well, hey, now, even in one country, I got good guys like you and bad guys like Tom, okay, and criminals. And so I have to be able to distinguish the outputs that were adjudicated from those that were not. So happily, I discovered serendipitously a company spun out of Stanford that has developed this super high scale digital signing infrastructure. And all the hardware's there, and all the confidential computing stuff that we've done for a couple of decades all creates a platform where you can do that. So I say, great, my adjudicator will sign everything it outputs. All right. And so now I can tell this stuff came from an AI that was, and I know the provenance of it, and I can tell you that it was adjudicated, and therefore it's okay to take it. And if Tom doesn't get his sign, he operates criminally, or he's in another country that isn't part of my collaboration. I know that stuff wasn't signed by any adjudicator that we all agreed on. So now I can distinguish sort of the stuff that's been evaluated from the stuff that hasn't, and I can keep scaling that up. And so then the last part, just to kind of, because there's a lot of tech people here too, the other problem, which was alluded to in your comment, is this is not like nuclear weapons, in part because we didn't have a policy about non-proliferation for the software stuff, and software is harder to control. So that required us to take an extra leap, which was, okay, now we not only have to be able to know what was signed, but we need to find a way to essentially filter out the traffic that's being generated by these things and by actors that we don't know. And this, in part, is necessary right now in our mind because of the cybersecurity risks that are being escalated by the use of AI in the hands of bad actors. And so right now, our view is the good guys don't stand a chance. That even though, yes, it can help them write code and it might get better over time, in the at least short to midterm, the attacker still has the advantage. That even if the AI was going to examine all your code, the computational cost of trying to find every bug in every existing piece of software and repair it is got it done. So we want to go back and use the AI, in a sense, as a motivation for adding back to the internet to some extent a couple of features that it never had with respect to identity and the ability to control traffic. So what we want to introduce is some idea of like a VLAN or set of VLANs on the internet, where at the base traffic level, we essentially can create, network enclaves where the only traffic in there is stuff that's now been either adjudicated or signed. And so that gives us a way to deal with the non-proliferation issue in an indirect. It doesn't solve every part of it, but at least for those that leaves behind, like a guy in a garage making a biological weapon, and he wants to deliver it not on the internet. Fine, but now we can at least use AI and our other means to go look for those guys and try to suppress those risks. But the one that I worry about the most, essentially the lights out problem right now, which you're watching happen in Poland last week. And that's going to become a nightmare very quickly. So we have to solve all these problems together.
Craig, talk a little bit about why you think we need to and must start with the U.S. and China.
Yeah, how that would work.
It's a good question.
In part, I think it's kind of obvious now that the two powerhouses, economically, ultimately militarily, and technologically, are the U.S. and China. And one of the things that in my experience, many years now of dealing with the Chinese, was that they always felt that people weren't giving them their due, and they always felt like they were added the things that the West had already decided was going to be the way. And my view is, China has elevated itself, courtesy of the rest of the world helping it, to a point now where they can't be invited to the party late. And therefore, if we're going to try to get something that avoids a further polarization of the world, or a subdividing of the world in 2 or 3 parts, as the AI revolution takes place, then we need to say, look, it's in our mutual interest to essentially not go down the autarky path. All right, that even if all you cared about was trade, and of course, right now, Xi and Trump, they care a lot about trade. All right, and so if we really understood that if we don't solve this trust problem in some way that allows all flavors of products to be exchanged openly between these two countries and any others that choose to participate in this, then it's just going to get you're going to watch a faster and faster deterioration of the global economic order. And I don't think that either of those countries wants that. And since neither of them has an answer today, if we can bring forward an answer that they could commonly pursue, they're not taking the answer from, the U.S. or a U.S. company, or China or the Chinese company. They don't have to give up their own rule sets. They can just agree that the world needs one. Strangely enough, the world's a bigger and more complicated place than businesses are, but, the tech companies, in my time, often found ourselves, we even created that term co-opetition, right? We often found ourselves in a situation where it was much better to agree narrowly on something that would expand the market and then go compete for it than it was to just, duke it out and wait for things to happen. And I kind of, from my old guy's perspective, look at China and the U.S. and their tech companies and say, you have that same opportunity right now. That big op-ed that Tom and I sort of wrote, that said, look, one problem that ought to bring the two countries together is this one. All right. Neither has an answer. Both need an answer. And if they happen to choose a path that gave them a common architecture, even though they maintain their own rules, that would be a good thing for the world, and they could give it to everybody else.
So I'm reminded of this quote from Ronald Reagan: trust but verify.
Right.
How does that work in an international context? I can't even see it how it works among companies, let alone between the U.S. and China.
So the first thing, and that and when you look at this whole thing, there are, in my mind, there's 5 different parts that you have to solve for simultaneously. You have a technical part, a policy part, a legal part, a diplomacy part, and an implementation part. So we've done a lot of thinking about all 5 parts. But it turns out that here, what you're trying to do, a weird way to think about it is, we don't need a Manhattan Project to build the AI. We need a collective Manhattan Project to govern the AI. And to some extent, no one of the actors, there's 3 sets of actors on a global basis here, classes of actors. There's the techies, there's the governments, and there's the academy. And right now, they're all just sort of in a random walk looking for a role to play in trying to do this. The companies can't compel anybody to do anything. They can just sell products. Governments can compel behaviors or require adoption of things, but they have to know what to say. And in this case, by themselves, they don't know what to compel. Right? And the academy in a sense, it's a bit like our supercomputing days, where the marketplace has run in economic terms past the universities in terms of their ability to keep up. So here, I want to take the universities and say they collectively are the ones that society are going to look to for essentially evaluation, and validation and continuous improvement. So all the tricks of the trade that people are talking about trying to apply, like evaluation systems and proofs and all these other things, I think it's going to be a lot easier to try to, collectively apply them to one system that we know is super important and have to get right. But we, in a sense, have our own mutually assured destruction, not in the classic, nuclear weapons sense, but once you decide you're going to use this thing to adjudicate your AI and build your whole economy around it, then you got a real interest in keeping that thing wholesome and not having it be, the basis of conflict or advantage. And I can just say, having built, as other people have, these hyperscale systems, operating systems, and other things that do, in the end, attain that status. Okay, then I'm a person who believes that if we put our mind to it collectively and we found interest, you could. So the 2 years I've spent talking to the Chinese in this track 2 dialogue makes me think that, they know they don't have an answer and they are open to discussing one. And so, that's a personal perspective, but, it comes from 20 odd years of dealing with them and 2 years of working on this dialogue on strictly this question of how could we govern together. And so the time is coming. I mean, Trump is going to see Xi in April, and so, they're looking for things that they could lead on, I think. And this might be one they could. And that was the story that, we wrote that big op-ed in the Times a couple months back. And, so, and I see, some smoke signals in both camps that say, yeah, we know we have a problem with this AI thing. No one's coming forward with an answer. Maybe, my view is, wouldn't we be better to at least look at a co-opetition, game here and than to just let this thing go off into oblivion.
So how do you think, I'm interested how both of you think about the issue of, is this trust of what the product that's delivered from a company? Is it, how do you deal with intentional misuse, for example, which is rampant and probably as big a problem, right? You get the Cambridge Analytica, you get lots of misuse of this technology.
Well, to some extent, part of the problem is the way that we write rules, laws, etc., are not very good relative to anticipating problems that haven't happened yet. But in this case, we have to do that. One of the reasons that Dario and I kind of quickly decided you better get an AI to do this is you won't even know how these agents talk to each other. All right. So it's not like, and they're going to do stuff that we can't anticipate and might not even understand. So to be aligned, whether it's with rules or some moral and ethical grounding, which we think you can define, you really have to think that what you're trying to do is to train the adjudication system on our intent, not the letter of the words. And humans can't do that, but these machines can. And so, we've already done some experiments. We built a little company to try to do this, not globally, but just for multinational companies. And they just need to say, hey, I want to ship my product and I want to ship it in 11 countries. And the first thing they realize is, wow, the old ways we used to decide whether these would be legal in all 11 countries is we'd hired a bunch of lawyers and they would look at the product and they'd understand how it was operating and whether it passed all those laws or not. You can't do that anymore because this thing has stochastic behavior. And so you need an AI to look at its behavior and understand what the intent of the rules are. And in that example, we've also started to develop new tools to help people train on intent instead of just writing rules. I told people earlier today, it reminds me of when we were trying to make, automated inbox handlers. And first we gave people little rules, and people said, not interesting, doesn't handle any edge cases. Then we gave them a lot more rules. They said, way too complicated, don't know how to do it. And the only thing that did work was essentially watching each person, how they handle their mail for 2,000 or 3,000 PC. Yeah, oh yeah, I get that. I know how you want it.
Right.
So this is sort of like the super scale version of that.
Yeah. So Tom, how do you see something like this applying in China where there is no notion of privacy? If the government wants your data, they tell you, give me the data or I'm going to put you in jail. How does that, and that's a whole different set of rules. I mean, it was one of the issues that came up with Huawei, right? That people worried about a backdoor and all these sorts of things that would be very difficult to discover, right? How do you see this applying when we think, I understand your point, we need to do something, but how does it really work in practice?
I think the thing people most underestimate is how much China wants this kind of system for China.
Interesting.
I think that China has a huge problem with fraud.
Yeah.
Imagine when it's got AI, you're proliferating. So I think we underestimate how much, if you're a government obsessed with order and you're not interested in this, I don't think so. So I think there's a much richer basis for a dialogue. But it is going to be part of, I just think, one of the things that Craig and I did in this AI column is that this is our ideas. We just sit and we riff and stuff comes out, and so we're riffing one day about how to think about AI. And again, because I'm a translator from English to English, I'm always looking to make it explicable to me, and then I can share it with others. But to simplify something accurately, you have to understand it deeply.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's very easy to simplify something inaccurately. And so that's why I'm blessed to have a teacher like Craig. So when I make a statement, the world is flat, there was a lot of plumbing under that.
Yeah.
There was not just, an ad campaign. So we were riffing. And what if we just divided the history of the world into 3 phases? Okay. Because we saw each move as a phase change. So he said, what if we said that the first from the dawn of man to the printing press, we'd call it the age of tools, or the age of ice. We would treat humans as if they were H2O molecules, and technology is heat. Okay, so we go from and H2O molecules and ice. Obviously, they don't move around much; they're separated. That's what makes it ice. So along comes the printing press. Heat melts the ice into water. Now the H2O molecules melt and they flow. They flow horizontally, and they ideas flow and capital flows, people flow. That age lasts right up till 2022. These are the birth of AI. We call that age. Yeah, we call it the age of information, the age of water. More heat. AI comes along now. Transformer. Okay. Now the water gets boiled into steam, into a vapor. We call it the age of intelligence, the age of steam. Now, the beauty of this approach, we think, is that the thing of AI as steam is very useful because it's going everywhere. Unlike any other technology, it's going into your watch, into your toaster, into your car, into your body. It's going everywhere. But the beauty also of thinking about this as phase changes is that it's a little sobering because ice looks just like ice until it becomes water, until it becomes something completely different with utterly different behavioral properties. And that you cannot predict. Same from water to steam. So we're on the cusp of a phase change that we cannot predict. We can't even imagine what's coming, okay? Because we have no idea what a world of vapor, is actually like. So whenever people ask Craig and I what time it is, we don't give them an hour. We tell them the time is exactly 211.9 degrees Fahrenheit.
There we go.
We are 1/10 of 1 degree away from a fundamental change that is going to change, as Craig says, everything about everything. And so that's why when people come to me and ask a very legitimate question I'm asking myself, what about China? What will they do? We are in for some radical rethinking. And if we aren't, we're going to be a bad biological experiment.
So, I think in this time when we've discovered that, in fact, it's pretty easy to jailbreak a lot of these AI systems and cause them to do things that they weren't intended to do, or to give misleading data, or, as a recent publication from a number of my colleagues show, spit out massive amounts of copyrighted material when given a small prompt that contains the first paragraph, spit out most of Harry Potter from the first paragraph. So there's issues here that we haven't even begun to grapple with. What's the meaning of copyright? What's fair use?
But see, this is a perfect example
Yeah.
of why having every little AI company or big AI company trying to come up with their own ad hoc way of managing against a rule set that they have only sampled occasionally, and for which there's been no attempt to actually understand the intent of the rule.
Yeah.
So fair use, do you understand? You can read the statute, but why did fair use get created in the first place? How should fair use be interpreted with machines as opposed to humans? So this is my point: is if you are going to try to get every person who makes an AI, oh, by the way, we gave away all these AIs, including open source and open weights, to everybody for free.
Mm-hmm.
So how you think you're going to get all those people to do a quality job of implementing the intent of whatever rules your society had where you built and run this thing? Oh, and you want to ship it somewhere else? That's not going to work. I mean, as a good old software engineer, you say, is that a solution that is likely to scale and be reliable? Answer, no. All right. So that means you have to think at a system level, how do you re-engineer these? So you take these problems and you factor them out. And instead of making it, every company has their own, you basically say, no, I am independent of that thing. I'm going to just look at what went in, and I'm going to look at what's coming out, and I'm going to treat you like I treat a human. I'm not going to try to crawl around in your head. I'm just going to look at your behavior. I'm going to look at it over time, in context. And I, like a judge, am going to judge. I didn't call this a rule interpreter. Okay? I called it an adjudicator.
Yeah.
Because what we need to do is to take human intent and determine whether any AI's behavior comports with that intent or not. And if it doesn't, I block its output.
The AI system blocks its output.
Correct.
And who decides how to interpret those rules? I imagine inside the adjudicator are 1,000 lawyers sitting there concluding whether or not, how does this actually work?
And that's why, this can be a very long conversation, or a very short one. In a sense, we have to think differently about how you convey societal intent, right? At every level of granularity. So you can say, I've got national rules, but then, oh, by the way, you got churches. Churches don't live in the sovereign space, all right? They span it. So, but people care about those things. So you got, I got to factor those guys in too. So I've got the churches, I've got the federal rules or the national rules. Oh, but then I got city rules, and then I got state rules and city rules. And then companies have handbooks, they have rules.
Sure.
Oh, and then families have values. My kids, I don't want them to do this, that, or the other thing. It turns out the union of all those rules is still a tiny amount of data, to train. If you essentially can synthesize what the intent of a society is with respect to those. And it's a high dimensional problem, which humans suck at and the machine is really good at. And so we're taking advantage of the machine's ability to operate in this high dimensional space in real time, and that humans can't even imagine how to do it. So just like you sit there and hold your head, that's fine. But if you really put yourself in this AI environment and you say, look, what the humans have to figure out is how they want to convey the intent of the rules they've written. All right. So it turns out we've also created some new tools that actually accelerates that. The analogy I would give you for that is, you'll remember this time, I'm sure, we wanted to write diagnostics for computers. And we decided, you can't do it exhaustively. So what did we do? We would come up with special ways of putting diagnostic buses and chains and stuff. And then we'd find ways of carefully analyzing how much stimulus you had to give in each thing to ensure that you had coverage over the whole machine. We've sort of taken, I'll say an analogy, and built some new tools. Because in this case, we're not trying to debug a machine that has an arbitrary number of states, but we are trying to take the universe of all the humans, rules from moral and ethical groundings on up through what they've articulated. We think of this as three classes of rules. There's the doxa, which comes from anthropology. There's the natural laws, which is where humans have observed things. They don't all write them down the same way, it turns out. Even the laws of physics aren't written down the same in different parts of the world. All right. And then there's the positive laws, which is all the things that humans have articulated. But what we realize is in the current world, all those things, are imperfect in the way they're operating, that they operate. And most of them are designed only to deal with bad behavior after it's already happened. That won't work in this case either, because if you think these risks are existential, you don't get the replays necessary to do it the classical way. So I think of justice the way I think of medicine now. Medicine, courtesy of these machines, is going to move from curative to preventive. And I think justice, by and large, will have to make the same transition from ex post facto determination of what we don't like to a much more nuanced ability for the machine to understand our intent, as communities, and then be able to make judgments that exceed what a human could do, at scale. And that's a qualitatively different deal, but to me, it looks tractable.
So it sounds a bit like it's a Minority Report situation, right? Where you have the AI running something predicting Tom is going to misuse this AI to do something bad. Therefore, I'm going to prevent him before I really understand what he's doing somehow.
Yeah, but what we can do is we have an audit trail of all these things.
Yeah.
So you basically, my view is you'd rather essentially stop him and raise a flag that said, I'm not sure about that guy, but I did let him go. All right, because now I have a common audit trail. In fact, I can take all of the behavior of the adjudication system from all the participating societal elements, and I can give them feedback about what their humans are doing or what their agents are doing that they never thought about. But what we want to do is imbue the machine not only with an understanding of the rule sets, but we want to imbue it with what we think of as the doxa. And the doxa, I was not familiar with it, but the cultural anthropology people said, it's the unwritten rule of common moral and ethical groundings that is common in all human societies. It appears to have been propagated folklorically before there was the information age. All right. And that's how it's common globally to almost all these societies. So you say, okay, I can use that as a backstop. That was one of my other problems when I first started thinking about this, was if I could observe that the machine was about to do something for which no human had ever written a rule, what was I supposed to do? And so in this case, the backstop is the doxa, all right? Because it's unwritten. It can only be learned. But I said, hallelujah, because that means the machine can learn it.
Yeah, sure.
Right? But I don't have to arm wrestle with anybody about whether they like it or not. And that gives me a way to get the whole thing bootstrapped. And then the feedback process, it says, wow, did you know how many times, the Hennessy kids were basically falling into the doxa as the only thing that kept them from doing crazy shit?
I don't even know how many times.
Right. But I'm just saying, there's a lot of things you can do to factor it out.
John, just say one thing, that we're all worried about AI, what jobs it's going to take away. If there are young people here thinking about a job, in the age of AI, working on these kind of systems is going to be a guaranteed lifetime career. Working on adjudicators.
Yeah, I think there'll certainly be lots of jobs for people who know how to use AI and know how to police it, right? There'll certainly be lots of jobs for that. So I'm still trying to grapple with how you deal with very different societal rules. For example, in China, you would have a rule that says you can't use the AI system to criticize the government.
Right. So it doesn't do it there.
But then that system, they ship it to the U.S. and now it says, you can't criticize the government. No. The rule disappeared. You changed the rules.
Yeah, I have U.S. rules and there's China rules. So when that product is adjudicated in this country, it's my rules in my house.
Yeah.
And I don't care who made the AI.
Okay. And how do we, given that, as you said, there's this competition versus cooperation in the industry, and all it takes is one bad apple to kind of undermine the system. So even if the companies agree that there'll be some kind of trust validation, whatever you want to call it,
They don't agree. The government tells them.
the government tells them.
This is the role
Okay.
of the government.
So now we have to get the government to
Yeah, but
involve
now
in
they have a
figuring this out.
very, very specific role. All right, which is say, we have agreed to use this adjudication system in our country. All right, you got an AI, you want to ship it to anybody that does anything, it's got to hook up to this thing. It's like Kalia, when we
Yeah.
switched the phone network from twisted copper pair to digital, and they said, we still want to be able to see the calls, so we created a special mechanism.
Yeah.
All right, so this, things like that have got to be engineered.
So if this is something created as a legislative effort, right, that says here are a set of rules and things like that,
This thing
how does it evolve?
First, you got to separate rules
Yeah,
from the mechanism.
the mechanism, right?
Okay. So we're just collectively going to build one mechanism, and people feed in all the collective set of rules in a well-defined process,
Right.
and basically you think of this as essentially a wrapper around an existing AI. So it sees the inputs and it sees the attempted outputs, and then it makes a decision as to whether it's going to permit that output. If it is, it signs it. If it isn't, it doesn't. All right. And then the world moves along. The rules are just basically, the way I think of this in very simplistic terms, is what you want to have is a giant curated wiki. All right. And for each societal element who is in a participating, call it country for starters, the country figures out for that thing who their proxies are that take their rule sets and put them in on their page of the wiki. It says US rules, China rules, India rules, Europe rules, or French rules, or whatever they are. All right. And they don't have to negotiate with anybody. They just put them in. And all they expect is that when an AI is operating, essentially in the virtual sovereign environment of that country, it applies their rules in that context. And so you chunk this thing out into a bunch of separate activities, each engineered for purpose, and then you essentially compose a system out of them.
And the beauty is, if the US and China could actually agree on that, they would create a cordon. And other countries, you want to operate with us, you've got to apply the rules of the two AI superpowers.
Right. So there's a big advantage in getting China and the US on board because they're the two major players. And I think if we get them on board, things move along. Do you have questions from the? Okay, I think it's a good time to open up the floor for questions and see what people have in mind.
When we start here with the people here, and then
Well, I'll go one and one. Okay, here we go.
I'm Robert. I'm a sophomore studying history. So I was wondering your vision of your nightmare, I guess, of 2030 and, not only being able to trade soy sauce and soybeans. I guess my nightmare I'd add to that is my inability to travel back to China to visit my grandparents. What is the role of kind of people-to-people connections at a very much lower level in facilitating these higher level dialogues? And then secondly, this is more for Mr. Friedman, but I'd like to know how you think that this new era is going to affect writing and reading. I'm a columnist for The Daily, and I'd love to kind of how has the past 4 years, I guess, since 2022, how have you seen kind of the early effects of this on our ability to write and our ability to read?
the first one, I don't have anything particularly original to say. Nothing disappoints me more the way the U.S. and China have fallen into this situation where we kicked out all their journalists, they kicked all our journalists. The New York Times has 2 people covering 1.4 billion people in China. I don't know how many China has in Washington exactly, but that's not a healthy situation at all. And the sooner we get that reversed, I think the better to have these kind of dialogues that we're talking about. My own experience, with using AI in writing, which is still very limited, is this, that if you ask Gemini Pro 3 to write a Tom Friedman column about China, okay, frankly, it's not very good. it'll give you the average of my average, whatever. But what I find is if I come up with what I think is a fresh and original idea, and I ask it to play with that idea and to riff with it, sometimes the answers are really awesome, almost as good as riffing with Craig. So,
Got a new coach coming.
yeah, that's right. And so one of the things that worries me about AI and writing a little bit is that I think it's really going to benefit the smartest people, in terms of creativity. We kind of think of it as a leveler, but I'm this is just a guess, but I'm a little worried about that it's going to make smart people like super creative. And don't include me among the smart people, but you know what I'm trying to say, that, and people who, it's more than just the prompt, good prompt. It's you got to come up with, if you come up with a really original idea, it's really interesting to me, but if you can't, if it's just my drain is stuck, how do I repair the drain? That's fine. But I think we're so much at the beginning of this. I don't know, but that's one of my initial, just early experiences. Ask me next year if it's different, but that it could actually even create a wider gap in society rather than narrow. And that's one of my concerns.
So a question from Zoomland. So Jeff Hinton has been the purveyor of doom and existential risk theory. A, do you really believe there is this really existential risk that's going to play out? It could play out relatively quickly. And B, if that's the case, then shouldn't governments intervene in a rather aggressive way?
I got a chance to be in some meetings with Jeff in the summer. And while he has, along with other people, including, Bill Gates and a lot of other, Elon Musk, and there were a lot of people who said, hey, we shouldn't do this because it's going to be, problematic. But at the end of the day, we're doing it. And one thing that I found interesting about Jeff's, I'll say more recent comments, was he sort of has recognized that the idea that we could just stop is not going to happen. And in the remarks I have heard him make a number of times now, he's saying, what we really have to do is figure out how to engineer this machine to be kind, to be benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And in a weird way, the thing that I'm talking about is my way of doing what he wants. All right, which is to create a mechanism where we can have the effect of kindness and benevolence and rule, following, and really intent, that the AI will grow up and be able to continue to be aligned, if you will, or essentially coexisting and then co-evolving with us. When the machine makes this transition, from coexistence where we can collaborate with it to solve problems that we think are important. Once it basically gets into where it's controlling its own evolution, then we better have been prepared. The one thing that drives me a little nuts, frankly, is how the degree to which humans these days tend to talk about this like we're victims. But we made this thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that we are all that we can be. But I think that to get beyond our current limitations, whether it's in healthcare or other things, the AIs are going to be the mechanism by which we are empowered to advance our own species. And that I really want to think about, what the advanced human species looks like against the advancing machine species. And then we're in this coevolution period. And I don't hear, in my mind, nearly enough talk about how we're going to organize ourselves to prepare for what is imminent. And if you look at the rate at which this thing is affecting biological research, it's stunning.
Yeah.
And so, the first application of that is going to be healthcare. But really we're talking about re-engineering the human species. We just call it healthcare. But why would it stop there? You know,
Yeah.
if I want to go to Mars or
Yeah.
space travel and whatever it is, you know, will we redesign ourselves? These things I think are equally important questions to be thinking about philosophically and operation in this critical time. And to have time to do that, we've got to make sure that this thing doesn't go off the rails, you know, during this transition time.
You know, just to pick up on something Craig said, that we literally have birthed a technology that could solve every problem.
Yeah.
From climate to energy to health. The great tragedy for humanity is if we couldn't collaborate enough to get the best and cushion the worst of this.
Yeah.
I think that's the giant challenge we have going forward. Which is why the last chapter of the book I'm writing is called America First. Only it's obviously a play on Trump. That we need to be the first to prove we can collaborate as now a much more diverse country, that we can build out of many one in America, because we actually have to do that for the whole world.
Yeah.
And all this may sound romantic and whatever until you think about what happens if we don't.
Yeah, well, I think your point about China, Tom, is spot on. If we don't come to some agreement about how we're going to limit the use of AI in weapons, for example, we are headed for a mess. And that really is an
But there you've got the trust but verify.
Yeah, you have the trust but verify.
So the question is, what is the mechanism by which you'll decide to control those weapons?
Agreed.
And how do you verify that?
Yep.
And that all takes you back in one form or another to this same question.
Yeah, it does. Okay, about back.
Thank you. My name is Brian Block. I have a nightmare too. It's in 2026, this November. Misinformation, disinformation, intrusion in the elections. For example, Russian hacking groups like Cozy Bear, Fancy Bear. I'm afraid of a cocaine bear getting involved with our midterm elections. How can you make my nightmare not become a reality? What needs to happen?
I'll give you my thought is, and I don't know if I don't know that we have enough cooperation right now, even in this country, to decide, even if I told you tomorrow exactly what to do, that we would be able to get our act together enough to do it even now in November. But when I talked about trying to build these different technical mechanisms, you know, including signing and adding robust identity, you know, the biggest challenge, the biggest reason the misinformation problem exists in my mind is because we didn't require identity. We granted people a degree of anonymity on the internet that they don't get in the real world.
Which China didn't do.
And China didn't do that. All right. So it turns out the reason it's so easy for pick your favorite bad guy to generate this misinformation and to cultivate, you know, cult followers and other things is because you don't know who anybody is. So, you know, if I had this problem and I could write an executive order tomorrow, the first thing I would do is I would just say, tomorrow it's illegal to operate any online service in the United States without validated identity. It turns out most of these services tell you the option of validated identity. Right? It's not like it's hard to do. All right. But that one thing and the ripple effect of that one change would make a huge difference in your nightmare. And you could do it quick. And so in a weird way, China did this experiment for us, you know, in the Cyberspace Administration. They created the first rule they made. There's no online service without validated identity. And people over here say, oh, that's terrible because they just want to surveil their people. But actually, I know personally, because I was involved in those discussions with both countries at the time, that they weren't worried about surveillance. They were worried about the things that are your nightmare. And that's why they actually put that in place. And Tom and I wrote a column about this 6 years ago. I said, guess what? Europe, United States, both under the banner of privacy, have granted anonymity on the network, you know, to everyone. And it is a root cause of our nightmare. And so without any more magic than that, I can tell you could make a huge difference between here in November by just putting that out tomorrow.
I would just jump in with a couple of things. One is, so I have never looked at Twitter. I have never looked at Facebook. I've never looked at Instagram. I've never looked at TikTok. I've never looked at any social media, and I've never smoked a cigarette. And my plan is to die saying all five. Okay. And because I consume zero social media, I will tell you a secret. You'll take it the right way. In my world, everybody likes me. Okay. So I did not come into this room and sit down with John and say, John, did you see that tweet about me? Believe me, I know I'm the subject of what's going on out there. But it's y'all have a good time. You are not in my head. So I leak no energy on you. Right? So that's number one. My number two piece of advice is walk, fly, bike, ride, slide, slither, whatever you can do to vote in November and to register someone to vote.
Yeah.
Because this is all about power. And without power, we got nothing.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. Do we have time for one more question? Okay. Who's going to get the final question here? Okay.
Hi, my name is JJ. I'm a freshman and I'm a student journalist here. Mr. Friedman, you said a while ago that in order to simplify something accurately, you need to understand it deeply. So I'd like some help simplifying this. You summarized this as a mechanism and a set of rules. And you said that the mechanism here is like sort of a wrapper around the AI that is intended to be internationally agreed upon. But then we also defined the rules specifically as a sort of wiki that you can, different countries can. Yes, I'm referring to what Mr. Mundie said, but I'd like for both of your input on this. My question, I suppose, is if each country can set their own rules as to what they believe is a good intent or a bad intent, then what is even the purpose of this global system or this global mechanism for rules?
I'm going to let Craig take that, but I said, good question, but I'm going to let Craig take it. Too good for me.
There's several things. First, if you build a system like this, then all the rules are transparent. So a lot of the things today, I mean, we don't know what the real rules are, that people are being governed by in any of these other countries, including this one. All right. And so if the AI is going to become a big force in essentially how we run our world or our country, then at least knowing the guy that you're doing business with is not only adjudicated by the same mechanism, but you know what rules there are. Right. So that's one, big advantage. And I think the other thing you have to be able to do is you have to get people into this system. And one of the things that I personally believe is once you started to operate this way and you invited more and more people into the party, what you'd find out is that, when you handed them their token to go put their rule set on their wiki page, and they could say, okay, I've got my rules. My rules are pretty short. I'm a little country. I've never thought about some of this stuff. And they can go look at all the other rule sets, from all the other countries. I think I'd like to be like the US, or I'd like to be like France. You can essentially cut and paste the rule sets or those that you like from another country, plop them into this thing, and tomorrow those things will work for your people. So in terms of, Bill Newcomb, who died recently, was a personal friend. And, he created create this World Justice Project. And what they're trying to do is go around the world and characterize the quality of the rule of law in every country in the United States. And, it's a painful process to both assess this stuff and then try to get each of them to advance, towards some more uniform standard of rule of law and implementation. And so this to me is a way where, you could facilitate that. There's so many countries that haven't got, the level of sophistication in thinking about this stuff. And if you think that this AI is going to change everything about everything, then finding a way to facilitate the transition from either no rules or rules that never contemplated this stuff, by cutting and pasting from the ones who as a country or a religion or whatever you like, and you say, I want to be more like that. All right. And so personally, I think this is a better way to let the New World Order emerge in terms of people having a choice, not by just wondering whether their parliament or their Congress happens to get their act together on a world-changing, event. And it becomes a lot easier to say, hey, well, more like that, less like this. And I think that would be a big benefit over the, short to midterm.
We clearly don't have all the answers, but I think the question Craig is raising and the mechanism he's describing is surely directionally right. And now it's time for all of us to put our heads together and and work on this. Because if we don't, we're never going to get the best of this amazing new technology, or cushion the worst.
That's a great line to end on, Tom. Let me please thank our two speakers here.